Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I discuss fake news about U.S. heat. I was checking out of the grocery store last night and I saw this cover from USA Today. It featured a map of the U.S. painted red, which was supposed to indicate that the U.S. is burning up. So of course I picked the newspaper up and looked closer at it. And I immediately noticed something very interesting, which I've highlighted in red here. It says, changes over the past 22 years, 1991 to 2012. Well, it's not 2012. That was 5 years ago. This is 2017. Before I get into their motivation for starting the interval in 1991, let's just look and see if their claim is accurate. And yes, the U.S. has warmed since 1991. So why start the interval in 1991? What is it about 1991 that made that year interesting to them? Well, 1991 was the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, a huge volcano in the Philippines. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, it spread huge amounts of volcanic ash up in the atmosphere, which reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. And the next 3 or 4 years were very cool as a result. You can see that dip which occurred after the eruption. The upward trend we're seeing is largely the result of the cool period on the left side of the graph. What would have happened if they'd started the graph actually 20 years ago? Well, it would have looked completely different. The U.S. has cooled over the last 20 years. The map in the article is just plain wrong. It shows a lot of warming across the U.S. over the last 20 years, when actually the U.S. has cooled over the last 20 years. But the problems with this article get worse. We actually have U.S. temperature data going back to about 1895. This is the average temperature at the 1,200 United States Historical Climatology Network stations. You can see that the warmest period in the U.S. was actually the 1930s. What I'm showing you is the actual measured temperatures from the NOAA thermometers. It shows that the U.S. cooled a lot from the 1930s to the 70s and has warmed since then. But it's not as warm now as it was in the 1930s. Let's look specifically now at U.S. summer temperatures and see what they're doing. Well, summer maximum temperatures in the U.S. have been plummeting for about 90 years. They were very hot in the 1930s. We had a hot summer in 1988, one hot summer in 2012, but for the most part, U.S. summer maximum temperatures have declined a lot since the 1920s. One very good measure of how hot a summer is how often hot days occur. This graph shows the percentage of summer days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We had some really hot summers in the 1930s. In 1936, almost half of days during that summer were over 90 degrees, whereas now we typically have about 1 day out of 4 is over 90 degrees. Let's do the same comparison now for days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. We see the same pattern. During the 1930s, we had a lot of days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Same thing in the 50s and in the 1980s. But generally, the frequency of 95-degree days in the U.S. has plummeted over the last 80 to 90 years. Next, let's look at 100-degree days. Once again, we see the same pattern. Very hot in the 1930s, very hot in the 1950s, very hot in 1980, but generally the frequency of 100-degree days has declined in the U.S. Now let's look at really hot days over 105 degrees. Once again, the same pattern. Very hot in the 1930s, very hot in the 1950s, very hot in 1980. But generally the frequency of 105-degree days has plummeted in the U.S. Now let's go back to the average summer maximum temperature graph, and we'll notice something very interesting. You remember where USA Today started their map interval in 1991? Well, right after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo was the two coldest summers in U.S. history. They started their interval at the coldest summer period on record. It's pretty obvious that if you start your statistics at the coldest period on record, you're going to show warming. That's guaranteed. But the 1930s was much hotter than now, and now I'm going to show you just how much hotter they were. This is a map of how hot temperatures were in 1936. Yellow pins show stations which reached 105 degrees during the year, and red pins show stations which reached 115 degrees during the year. These are incredibly hot temperatures, and they covered a very wide swath of the United States. According to all the experts, 2016 was the hottest year on record on Earth. So let's see how 2016 compared with 1936. This is the same map for 2016. Yellow pins show 105 degree temperatures, and red pins show 115 degree temperatures. Notice that the pattern here is what we've gotten used to now. Very hot temperatures are confined to the southwest deserts, and most of the rest of the country has been generally cool during the summer. Very few people are still alive who remember the heat of the 1930s, and the climate scamsters depend on that. But the U.S. was much hotter in the 1930s than it is now, and summer temperatures have been plummeting since then. Very few writers know how hot the 1930s were because they're too young, and because NOAA tampers with their data to hide the heat of the 1930s. The blue line is the graph I've been showing you, which is the actual measured temperature from NOAA thermometers. But the red line shows the altered data which NOAA presents to the public. They cool the past by a huge amount to make the past look cooler and to make it look like the U.S. is warming. But the U.S. isn't warming. Like almost all climate reporting in the press, the USA Today article was horrifically bad, fake news. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.